This
20
conference
slides.
will now be recorded.
Less than 20 slides. We have a good bit of time here, so we will have time at the end for Q&A and discussion. This is an evolving crisis. Things are happening almost literally while we speak. I had to put my phone away because I've broken the way you shut it down. So I had to take it out of the room in case somebody calls, but some of you probably have yours there. So raise your hand and let me know if something changes in the next hour and a half here of significance. So I'd like to start talking about the Ukrainian crisis and its implications for U.S. security by pointing your attention to a DHS-CIS alert that came out just 2 days ago. It was called a Shields Up warning. It was referencing the fact that Russia uses cyber attacks to disrupt and disable critical infrastructure, to increase pressure on governments, militaries, populations to accelerate their objectives. That comes from the actual warning. Well, what does this mean to us, and why is DHS issuing such a result? Well, I think the first thing we can say, and I'm fairly confident of this, watching what the Russians have done in the past, that an attack in Ukraine will probably start with a cyber barrage, which may not be limited to Ukraine. And the challenge that we face today is in today's interconnected, technologically enabled environment, geography has been shrunk, the sovereignty of national borders has been eroded, and thus the ability to contain a local conflict is severely jeopardized. So another way to put it is local can become global very quickly here. So with that, what are we going to look at today? Well, these are kind of the bottom line up front things that I see. First of all, we still don't know what Putin will do. At this point, I always like to quote General Hayden, who I've been fortunate enough to meet on a number of occasions, an incredible man. For those of you who don't know, Mike Hayden was both head of NSA and head of CIA, spent his career in the Air Force as an intelligence officer, really an outstanding, sorry to sound this way, but an outstanding American. And I remember talking with General Hayden, and he would always, we were talking in the counterterrorism world, and he said, you know, the challenge has shifted from the Cold War to when we went into a counterterrorism mode, because he said in the Cold War, we understood what the Russians' capabilities were, but we didn't know what their intent was. He said with Al-Qaeda, we know what their intent is. We just don't know what the capabilities are. Well, we're back to the original here. We know what Russia is capable of. All we have to do is look at the troops massed around Ukraine today. But we really don't know what Putin's intent is. And that's why I started with that. I think there are a couple other things that are really critical here for us to understand. This crisis presents a really interesting case study in Russia's hybrid war strategy, and we need to better understand this. I'll talk a little bit more about it in a few minutes, what their hybrid war strategy is, and how we understand it. One of the things I've been working on most recently has been some discussions with the Irregular Warfare Office at the Pentagon to talk about how we can do some training and education in this. So this is very relevant from kind of the stuff I do, but I think it's critical. I think the next takeaway is that the current situation poses a threat to both NATO and U.S. national security. And we'll get into that today. The U.S. is vulnerable to cyber attacks as a result of policy decisions and leaks of valuable information over time. And I think that's relevant to all of us, and understanding what those were and where we are is critical. And then I will conclude with kind of a range of policy options short of a kinetic response to deter and respond to potential Russian aggression. I'm not going to go through this. Mike did a far better job than I would. So here's what we're looking at today. Just very quickly, we're going to do an understanding of Russia's hybrid war strategy in the context of Ukraine, analyze the challenges to U.S. and NATO by the current crisis, define the cyber threat to U.S. critical infrastructure, and then discuss U.S. policy options.
Peter, I can just make this one announcement for everyone attending. First of all, welcome. Again, if you have questions for Dr. Forster, please submit them through chat. Per his request, I think we're going to probably hold most of the questions and do a more detailed Q&A after he's finished the presentation. But if there's something that is critical and flows directly into the line of discussion, we may have him answer that question during the presentation. So thanks. Back to you, Peter.
Thanks, Mike, and please just let me know if that happens. So I'm more than happy to interrupt the presentation to do that. I think one of the important things that we sometimes lose track of is what I may call the history of things. And if we're going to understand the concept of irregular war, or what NATO calls hybrid war, we really have to understand a little bit about war itself in the more traditional sense. And for that reason, I just wanted to do, this is the historian in me, bring us back to a couple of the great war theorists, Sun Tzu, the great Chinese philosopher, and Karl von Clausewitz, who of course wrote On War, which I believe is still mandatory reading at West Point. I'm not sure it is at the other academies, but I do know that it is at West Point. In its most basic form, we know that war is really primordial violence. It involves the support of people, of an army to prosecute it, and a government to control it. The target of war is the adversary's polity, or its population. The goal is to destroy your enemy's will to fight in order to compel them to your wishes. And this is accomplished by destroying their sources of strength. And this is probably the most important side of things that we take away from this is it talks about their physical and psychological capabilities to respond. And I think that's very pertinent in today's conflict. In Clausewitz's conventional triangle, the one you see the classic war there, war meant to erode the citizen's passion, to eliminate the commander's skill, to a point that the government either collapsed or saw no reason in continuing to fight. In today's world, these three have been encapsulated, these three ideas of government, citizens, and commander have been encapsulated in ideology, fighting for truth, developing global sympathies and support, and the injection of non-state actors that bring passion, charisma, and skill to the battlefield. Those non-state actors are very important, and we'll get back to those when we talk about the threat to critical infrastructure today. Last but not least on the war side of things, I put up a quote there it's not quite last, but by Sun Tzu. In all fighting, the direct method may be used for joining the battle, but the indirect methods will be needed to secure victory. This is a kind of a twist, or the way Sun Tzu put it is, when you go to war, you have to have first won the war by knowing your enemy. The actual physical kinetic side of war should follow something that the background that you've already done. So what does this mean today? Well, it means Russia's approach to war is to demoralize the citizenry, slow decision-making in the military, and limit government ability to respond, in which non-state threat groups play a role and seek to rally passion of global sympathizers through propaganda and fake news. So we'll stop with that at this point, and I'll move on. In Ukraine, I will say it is unclear the extent to which the United States really understands Russians' mindset and is prepared to effectively analyze intent remains questionable. It's not that the United States doesn't have expertise in this area, but there have been a number of decisions, such as refocusing on counterterrorism since 9/11, passivity in the face of mounting cyber challenges, and even a kind of rapprochement, if you will, with Russia. So we're a little bit behind the 8 ball here as we begin to look at where we are. So let's do a quick overview of where we are, the anatomy of the crisis. This is a map. There are much better maps on the news stations that give us an idea of where Russian forces are deployed around Ukraine as of just a couple days ago. As we know, Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. We'll talk about the implications of that because it does have implications. We also know that Russia is currently engaged with military exercises, if you will. I use the term loosely, with Belarus, which is obviously a theoretical independent state. But we'll talk a little bit about the Belarus situation. So what is Russia looking for? Why is this a crisis? Well, Russia's looking for a permanent guarantee that NATO will not expand eastward. They asked for no NATO troops in what were Russia's former Eastern European allies. And they asked really for a creation of a Russian sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, in the Caucasus, and Central Asia. Obviously, this mandate was unacceptable to NATO, and it would destroy it. To accept it would destroy it as an effective alliance. What are the options? Well, we can get into those. Russia might try to occupy and reintegrate reintegrate Ukraine. I'm not convinced that's what's going to happen. Estimates that I have seen say that would take up to around 100,000 troops to actually occupy the whole country. Ukraine is a huge country, larger than Texas, and they would probably face an insurgency. The second goal might be simply to annex the Donetsk and the Luhansk area up around and up perhaps as far north as Kharkiv, which is really the eastern part of Ukraine that is Russian speaking and is an area that since 2014 has been engaged in an ongoing conflict. This would also create a land bridge to Crimea and thus basically make the Sea of Azov a Russian lake that it really is already. But I think the other thing that it would possibly do from a Putin perspective is force regime change in Kiev, which may be part of his objective here. However, the downside is it would divide Ukraine and push the remaining sections to the west if he does not occupy the whole country. Now, what will he do? I believe there'll be a hybrid war strategy that might achieve desired responses without an invasion. Perhaps we look at even this as a feign and a decision to annex Belarus, which would, or bring Belarus back into the Russian polity, if you will, which would position Russia directly on the border with the Baltic states, would surround Ukraine and create more issues. Would create more issues for NATO as an alliance. So that's kind of the background of things. This kind of summarizes it. I think we need to be aware of where things are. The Ukrainian crisis certainly mirrors many of the identified causes of conflict: the perceived threat, a leader or national perception of destiny, scapegoat theory can be brought in here, miscalculations in testing other results. All of these things are things that we need to be concerned about in this. And on the left side, I've listed a few things that I believe that are both that are Russia's actual perspectives. The first is perhaps from Russia a national security concern about eastward expansion of NATO. We could go into a long history of this and a discussion of it. But I think there probably is, within Moscow, there is a concern about where this is. There is the belief that Putin has that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest disaster of the century, of the previous century, and that Ukraine has always been part of Russia, that there is always a historical part of Russia. I think there is a desire to test and potentially weaken NATO by exploiting the the divisions, and I'm going to talk about those in a minute within the alliance. I will say one of the things we need to understand is what George Kennan quoted there, both at the top of the slide. He gave us two quotes that I think are very relevant. One is, and we need to understand these when we think about how Russia may respond. One is that Russian leaders have no problem making themselves believe what is comforting or convenient. On the other hand, he also said that the Russians really have no distinction between offensive and defensive strategies, and an attack on Ukraine would quickly be seen as defending Russian territorial integrity and ethnic Russians. And lest we forget our history, it was the support of the Slavs, the Orthodox Slavs in Serbia in 1914 that brought Russia to mobilization as a cause of World War I. And then on a more relevant side of things, I think what we need to see is there is a desire within the Russian polity or within the Russian political structures to divide, distract, deflect, and probe. Those would be the four terms that I would talk about. I won't go ahead and read what's on the other side. I think you've had a chance to read that while I babbled on about where we are in the West on some of these things. So what does this mean? So let's talk a little bit about how the Russians view fighting war today. One of the, and we'll start with the quote by General Markov in 2013. One uses information to destroy nations, not networks. I think his comment is incredibly important for a couple reasons here. First of all, it illustrates the Russian thought on how they are going to use information in achieving political objectives, and how they will look to use information perhaps without using military force, and how they will look to shape positive global opinion if they decide that they will use military force. This was all captured in a 2010 military doctrine, and it hasn't changed that much. The second part of what Markov says, I think that's critical for us, is the timing. 2013, 9 years ago that he made this comment. So the Russians have been working on this irregular war, what they call new generation warfare, this asymmetrical approach to reducing adversaries' combat potential and support for nearly a decade, not quite, but nearly a decade. If we look at history, one of the greatest examples, or one of the interesting examples, is certainly what happened in Crimea in 2014, which the BBC nicely called the smoothest invasion of all time. And what happened in that place was that the Russians took control of what we might call the main battle space. And their convention of the main battle space is that it's the mind and influence operations that erode the will to fight. That's the center of gravity of this information warfare. And in Crimea in 2014, they operationalized this very well. Part of this is a concern because it means the Russians have had experience at how they're going to operationalize this. But what happened in 2014, February, in Crimea, was there were violent clashes basically between pro-government and anti-government forces. At the time, the president of Ukraine was a pro-Moscow individual by the name of Viktor Yanukovych. The clashes that took place in the square of Maidan in central Kiev, or what was known as the Revolution of Dignity, resulted in an EU-brokered agreement that in essence ousted Yanukovych and restored what had been achieved in what was known as the Orange Revolution in 2014. Okay, Dr. Forster, thanks for the history lesson. What the hell does all this mean? Well, I think what we need to understand is that this whole situation that took place in 2014 in the greater Ukraine was upsetting to Putin and to Moscow. They did not like what is happening. So what they did was, okay, the agreement had been signed, but they decided that they were going to take a step of their own. And this step was actually to invade and ultimately annex Crimea, the peninsula that we looked at in the previous map. What they did was they used civilian volunteers to infiltrate Ukrainian bases that were held by treaty. These volunteers also cut off main roads, and this all occurred at the end of February, the 28th of February, 2014. They combined this with cyber attacks on both Ukrainian government facilities and Crimea facilities. And within 3 days, the Russians had, in essence, neutralized Ukrainian military bases using what were then called the Little Green Men. These were individuals carrying Russian weapons, but with no insignia. As I said, cyber ops had shut down telecommunication infrastructure, disabled websites, had jammed mobile phone communications. And instead, the Russians were able to use information operations to exploit societal divisions, weaken the government institution, undermine the state, and ultimately simply take control of Crimea, which they then proceeded to annex. In essence, in a summary, Russian troops were better prepared to move. Their cyber activities were effective. And in all honesty, there wasn't really much. This happened very quickly. There wasn't much that the West could do, and they didn't do much, which is probably not a good thing. In my studying of Russia and Russian foreign policy, what do the Russians respect? The Russians respect a responsive strength. So what we had here was a basic annexation, really with very little what we would call traditional or conventional military force. As I said, the cyber operations in this conflict and in a conflict now in Ukraine will be critical. The Russians have actually created information warfare battalions. These are individuals whose their MOS, if you will, their military operational specialty is in the information domain. Another thing that we are beginning to understand is that the Russians are debating a conundrum that we see in cyber operations. And that conundrum is the friction between plausible deniability that a country may accept for doing something and the possibility of attribution. In Crimea, as in Estonia in 2007, as in Georgia in 2008, just to give you a litany of how the Russians have used information in cyber operations, they had always used individuals who were not necessarily, could not necessarily be tied to the Russian government, which gave them the plausible deniability, to use a term that came from the Reagan administration, where the Russians could say it wasn't us. This is some hacking group. This is some teenager sitting in his basement. This isn't the Russian government. However, the conundrum there is that when you don't use government organized groups, the sophistication of the attacks and the ultimate objectives may be not quite what you had hoped. You lose a little bit of command and control. And hence the Russians now have to debate whether they are prepared to have more sophisticated attacks, which could be tracked back to them. On the right side, you see that this is the diagram from the Joint Force Irregular Warfare Operations. I apologize for the blurriness a little bit, but it really kind of gives you an idea that irregular war encompasses everything from counterterrorism and counterinsurgency to information operations, everything really outside of what we would consider the conventional warfare environment. So moving on, So what are the concerns with NATO? Well, as I said earlier, one of Putin's goals in Ukraine is to probe NATO's resolve as an alliance. Or put it another way, is how might defections occur on decisions to implement sanctions? He wants to demonstrate a division in a decision around Ukraine. And this gives us pause as to where things might go. So alliance unity, and this is different than credibility, but alliance unity is a significant concern. We've seen a lot of discussion over the last couple of days of everybody saying, yes, yes, yes. NATO is absolutely in line. We're speaking with one voice as an alliance. However, is that really the case? Do we really know that people are prepared to take the political and economic cost of what's going on? So, at the fundamental basis, the question becomes, are forces willing perhaps to go to war over Ukraine? No, NATO forces are not willing to go to fight over Ukraine. But what the Russians are trying to determine is, are NATO forces prepared to go to war over Estonia, which is actually a member of the alliance? Second of all, so alliance unity, and this unity, we can talk as one voice, but it comes down to credibility, because by its nature, NATO is a slow decision-making organization. It has freedom because it is an organization, an alliance that is built upon consensus of more than 30 members. Now, all of you have been in a room and trying to get consensus where you've had 30 people around a table, and trying to get consensus on any point is nearly impossible. Think about it in the context that you may be looking at a military confrontation. So the whole structure, NATO's political structure, if you will, is one that has a tendency to slow its decision making, slow its freedom of action, which is actually an advantage that Putin understands very well, because he faces none of these questions in his activities in Ukraine. Since it's governed by unanimity, NATO can come out with a comment that says we are all together. However, there's an out clause in the North Atlantic Council, or what is known as the NAC, and that is that while we can come up with a NATO statement, every member of NATO retains its own sovereignty and its own decision-making rights. And thus, it could step away at some point and say, yes, I agree, but I'm not going to do what I need to do to actually create alliance credibility, if you will. And I think the most important thing for those of you who don't know, the most critical function within NATO is Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, which was NATO's founding document. And this is the article that says an attack on one NATO member is an attack on all. Again, you're here, Dr. Forster, what the hell are we doing? How does this apply to Ukraine? Because Ukraine's not a member. That's absolutely true. But keep in mind, and if you look at the map at the bottom, the green countries being NATO countries, a number of those were either part of the Warsaw Pact, or in 3 cases, they were actually part of the Soviet Union. So that's what I mean by probing. So alliance credibility. Well, alliance credibility is the second stage. And where our credibility comes from here is there are cleavages within the alliance. There's a lack of trust of the United States that is going on right now following the Trump administration's approach to NATO. We've seen Merkel's era end in Germany, and we're not sure who the new German chancellor is or what he stands for. We know that Boris Johnson is weakened domestically in the UK, and we know that Macron is looking to become the leader a leader, the French president, within the alliance. There have been rightist swings in Poland and Hungary, which in essence jeopardize some of the alliance's most fundamental premises: rule by law, independent judiciary, things like that. We know that Turkey on its southern flank has played a disruptive role. Turkey's been buying Russian arms. Turkey is also focused on its southern border with more of a concern right now on what's going on in Syria and Iraq, and what's going on with the Kurdish population. We have German and Bulgarian energy supplies that Russia provides. So this all feeds into this unity and credibility. But the credibility really comes down to actions. Are you prepared to act? And I'll throw out some questions because I don't think anyone knows who's not in the room in Brussels talking about this. So is Turkey, with its ties to Russia, prepared to impose stiff economic sanctions if that's where NATO would go? What is meant by the German term strategic ambiguity, which is a term that the German chancellor has used recently? How do we look at the comments by now former Admiral Schonberg, of the commander of the German Navy, who was forced to step down after he talked about the fact that Putin has legitimate claims in Ukraine, and that we actually should be recruiting Russia in fighting in the fight against China. So this is where the credibility hits the road. Unity is one thing, we can talk about it. Credibility means action. And is NATO prepared to take action? And we wouldn't really know, right? We don't know yet. I believe they will, but it may not be as all 30 countries as we hope. The third part then of the NATO quandary for the United States is what I term burden sharing, a topic that I know a little bit about. This is what I actually wrote my doctoral dissertation on, but I won't bore you with that. If you're having trouble sleeping, I'll be glad to send you a copy of the book, so that you can get rid of your insomnia. But burden sharing traditionally, and the way we know burden sharing, is that it revolves around allied commitments to defense efforts. The 2% defense spending, GOP, 2% of GOP is often heard. But the concept really goes beyond that. The concept of burden sharing, and it feeds into this unity credibility thing, is who's willing to assume the risks of actions. And really this comes down to potentially who dies. I'll give you a quick example in Afghanistan, where when German forces were deployed to Afghanistan as part of the NATO coalition forces to combat to help stabilize the country and combat the Taliban, they were deployed in the north to Maraz al-Sharif, up near the Uzbek-Tajik border. Why do I bring this up? Well, the Canadians, also a NATO member, were deployed to the south, where they had to fight the ongoing insurgency in places like Helmand province. And so that's a clear assumption of risk. There were deaths among the Canadian soldiers. In the end, there were a few within the German forces too. But the reality was, the Germans said, in alliance unity, we will be involved. But from a credibility perspective, they said, we're going to deploy our troops up to the north. Interesting little anecdote here. I think we have time for it. I remember sitting down with a German, he was a captain, perhaps a major at the time, armored officer at one point, who had been deployed to Mazar al-Sharif. And he said, can you imagine? He said, we were deployed. We had our Leopard 2 tanks there in north of Afghanistan. They were basically sitting in mothballs at this point. It's probably 2007, 2008. They're not really being used. And lo and behold, the Canadians came up and said, hey, we really need those Leopard 2s. Would you ship them down to Helmand province? As you can imagine, those of you who've been in the military, the major was livid at having to give up his material. But it speaks to this unity alliance, this credibility, a unity, burden sharing side of things. Burden sharing is then also about the provision of material. And we know in the current conflict that Germans have both refused to ship weapons to Ukraine, but they've also prohibited any Russian weapons that have been sold to other NATO members to be provided to the Ukraine. So there's the, in essence, of the material. And then the last one is strategic leadership for global global order. Who is prepared to do that? Is that the United States? It typically has been since 1945. I believe we are still the country that will do that. But we still have to ask our allies, and this is the last, maybe the most significant thing, is are our European allies willing to absorb the impact of rising energy costs? If the Russians cut off their gas supply, if Nord Stream 2 is not connected as all part of sanctions against NATO. So that's the NATO concerns. They're very complex. And I'm not sure how, we don't know necessarily, it's unclear. The next concern, though, and the ones that probably many of you are interested in, is what are the strategic concerns to us? What are our national interests? Certainly US credibility as a leader for global order is one of the things we're looking at. We've had a series of circumstances really over almost the last decade. We had a passivity, and this is the advantage of being an academic. I can say things that maybe others won't say. There was a passivity in the Obama administration. Probably the one that I would point to when it came to leadership was the infamous red line in the sand over Syrian use of chemical weapons. The red line was crossed and nothing happened. There was the Trump administration's isolationism, the American First policy that withdrew us from withdrew us from international responsibilities in some respects. There was the withdrawal from Afghanistan that occurred in August, which has further led to question where we are. So the U.S. is very concerned about how it deals with this from a national security perspective. Second thing, I talked about alliance credibility. Well, from a U.S. perspective, they are studying, I know they're studying, that is Putin really testing Article 5? Probably not to the point that he wants to encourage a kinetic response from NATO. This would be obviously with regard to the Baltic states. But this whole system that is going on here in Ukraine is a way of seeing where he can establish an upper hand versus NATO and the United States. Then the last thing is the direct threat to the United States, and in particular, its critical infrastructure. I use this little map here, and I'm stealing something actually from Director Mueller. I saw him a few years ago give this talk on cybersecurity, and he started off this way, and it's very true. Rome built 52,000 miles of roads to extend its power. However, as Rome's power eroded, these roads allowed the armies to march into Rome that finally ended the empire. The interconnectivity that these roads meant created a threat. And we are in the same situation with our critical infrastructure. We have the connectivity, the interconnectivity of our critical infrastructure puts us at jeopardy. There's so many entrance points that it's tough to defend them on. And we need a national security posture that understands these threats, particularly as it comes to critical infrastructure. Now, what are the threats? Well, the threats will be cyber. And cyber tends to be perpetrated by nation state actors. Iran, Russia, North Korea, China are always the ones that we look at. But in this reality, there is a real possibility that Russia may decide that as part of an activity in Ukraine, that it might be worthwhile launching a cyber attack against some U.S. Targets. And this could be state-sponsored operations targeting things like industrial control systems with destructive malware or things like that. People say, really? Is that really a possibility? Well, let's dig into this a little bit, because this is, from my perspective, a significant concern as to where we are. And what we're really talking about now is cyber war, cyber operations, and its evolution. Another little tidbit, another little story. 1982, there's an explosion in a Soviet pipeline out in Siberia. It was actually caused by a malfunctioning computer system. The Russians, the Soviets, had stolen the computer system from Canada and implemented it on their pipeline. However, the Central Intelligence Agency had tampered with the equipment, making it seem to work fine. And when the Russians, in essence, plugged it in, boom, the pipeline blew up. This would be perhaps the first cyber attack in history. This is all the way back in 1982. But what we know is today, cyber attacks are a reality. Whether they reach the level of war is a debate, but we've seen a number. When we talk about cyber war, there is a definition, but I'm not sure if the definition fits. Actions by a nation state to penetrate another nation's computers or networks for the purposes of causing damage and disruption. Okay, that's fine. That's a definition where we might respond kinetically. But there are a lot of incidences where we have seen cyber operations that may not reach quite that level, or even do reach that level, and have not resulted in military response. One would be the Stuxnet circumstances back in 2010, when malware was implanted into the nuclear centrifuge, into the centrifuges in Iran that were spinning, that were enriching uranium. They caused the centrifuges to speed up, slow down until they actually burned out. That was certainly a cyber attack. It caused damage, it caused disruption. We didn't see a kinetic response to that. Another example came in 2016 when there was a malware attack at Saudi Aramco. There was one actually in 12 that disabled Aramco's, that disabled 30,000 computers in Aramco. That was devastating enough. There's damage and disruption. In 2016, however, the malware that was installed actually shut down Aramco's emergency shutdown system, so that if there had been a leak at some point, the shutdown system was not able to, would not have been able to respond. I use this often today when I talk about the possible combination of cyber and kinetic attacks. Think about what would happen in an environment today where a system was shut down, and then all of a sudden there was a drone strike, for example, on critical infrastructure, and the emergency shutdown system didn't work. So as I said, so what are then tensions globally certainly raise the risk of cyber attacks, but we've dealt with a number of cyber attacks recently that have been perpetrated by someone. This is that attribution thing, and I'll get to that in a second. Keep that in mind. But I wanted to first give a little bit, just I don't know how experienced, how knowledgeable people are on this, but there are really cyber attack vectors. There are three different vectors. One is the attack on the computer itself. We know this as ransomware kinds of attacks, or denial of service where the computer doesn't work. There are cyber attacks on the data. And you say, oh, well, okay, yeah, we're very familiar with data extraction from a variety of systems. But I think one of the things we need to remember is these attacks can be just as deadly. If you think about it, the hack of the Office of Personnel Management a few years ago, probably by the Chinese, resulted in the release of the names and addresses of individuals who held top secret clearances in the US government. This, of course, opened them up to the potential for other kinds of activities. And then the last one is the computer as a facilitator. I've already talked about the attack on Aramco as an example of that. However, we have to also think about it in a couple of other environments that are maybe a little more familiar to you. One of those would be the Colonial Pipeline shutdown of a year ago. And then another one was the cyber attack on Maersk, the shipping company that disrupted the supply chain. So what we're really saying here is, in this, I titled it cyber war, but it's more than cyber war. We're talking about changing implications for how conflict is fought. We're talking about new targets. We're talking about new methods of attack. We'll talk in a minute about potential retaliation. But all of these are objectives that are evident in today's Iranian crisis. So just very quickly, and I think I saw a question actually pop up about independent hackers versus state hackers. So this gives you a continuum of the responsibility of a state in dealing with cyber possibilities. It runs all the way from a nation state prohibiting all kinds of cyber activities emanating from within its sovereignty to state executing kinds of things. Where are we today? Well, right now we still seem to be in this environment that it may be rogue elements conducting attacks that may be kind of winked at, I use the term ordered, by state authorities, perhaps even coordinated. But I also would premise the thought that the Russians would be able and capable of a state executed attack, in which they would then use cyber forces under their direct control in Ukraine, but potentially in the United States. So here are the threats. This is why we're in the situation we are in, from my opinion. The Cybersecurity and Information Security Agency, CISA, talks about critical infrastructure as the physical and cyber systems and assets that are so vital to the United States that their incapacity or destruction would have a debilitating impact on the nation's physical and economic security, and on the public health and safety of the American people. There's 16 critical infrastructure sectors in the United States. The federal government has been seeking to protect these since the early 2000s, but insufficient resources were really had been applied to cybersecurity protection really until the creation of Cyber Command, and then its ultimate standing up as a military command in 2018. There are other challenges that we face. This is that a significant part of the critical infrastructure in the United States is held by the private sector. Well, why is this problematic? Well, because if you are thinking of cyber attacks, you need to be able to convince those people who do the cost-benefit analysis of critical infrastructure that it's worth the cost, that the benefit of cybersecurity is worth the cost. Even in the situation, and we'll go back to the Continental Pipeline situation, even in that situation, you know, they were willing to pay more than $4 million to end the ransomware attack. If you begin to look at what the revenues are of Colonial Pipeline, that was a small amount compared to what they make. He was willing. So that's part of it. There are other challenges that exist in the private sector. Accurate inventories of systems and devices that hold data are lacking. And this information actually comes from a report that just came out at the end of last year. Let me find the citation for those of you who might be interested in reading it. It's from the Cybersecurity and U.S. Critical Infrastructure Findings of the Summer 2021 research study produced by Cyber Risk Analysis last summer. That's where I'm getting this information. And it actually is very good on giving you the actual percentages. There are challenges in the ability to detect and respond to destructive attacks. There are questions about recovery techniques, such as backup systems, which also can be targeted in a sophisticated attack. And there is always a question about the lack of insufficient number of security professionals. If you have children, I would highly recommend, if they are technologically disposed or even policy interested, I'll do some ungrateful, I'll do some unsolicited promotion here. Cybersecurity program at Penn State's College of Information Sciences and Technology is something you ought to consider. I know a number of people, including one of my daughters, who has graduated from that program, and they find really good paying jobs with what they do. So that's the second part. So we have a government that's been slow, although is improving significantly in what they're doing. And as we've seen a couple of things. I've been critical of a number of administrations, but we do know that the Obama administration put in the Comprehensive National Security Initiative. The Trump administration signed the National Security Presidential Memo 13, which increased the ability to use offensive cyber operations, which is a deterrent technique. And we know that the Biden administration has signed an executive order. So our government has picked up the pace. They understand the criticality. We're just starting from behind the curve, if you will. The last thing that has hurt us in this has been disclosure of cybersecurity approaches. Now, some of this is dated. Snowden released his information back in 2013. I'm not privy to how these things have been corrected since then, but the Snowden leak was actually very devastating to our cybersecurity. His treacherous relief both gave up how we collect information at the NSA, but also a number of our cybersecurity defense initiatives were released by Snowden. Second of all, or third of all, if you will, the Snowden disclosures also ended up in a schism between the public-private partnership, which is so critical for critical infrastructure protection. Point two, it's held by the private sector. We have talked with the private sector if we're going to create a robust, secure system. And that was, Snowden put a real wrench into that PPP, the private-public partnership, because private organizations were hesitant to become involved with the U.S. government because they were hesitant to be accused of actually spying for the U.S. government. So Snowden's thing, 2013, admittedly, but it was devastating. I think we've recovered. I don't know for sure, but we have had that. We've had that situation. The other leak, so Snowden, if we think of it as insider threat, was actually malicious insider threat. The second one was the internal blue release, which wasn't really, it was simply incompetence. This was a situation where some government employees actually, for some unknown reason, took home a variety of offensive cyber weapons, if you will, they were on their home computer. These were actually hacked, and it was these systems that became the foundation for the WannaCry ransomware attack in 2017 that eliminated, that targeted the British National Health System, and for the non-Petya attack that I talked about earlier that targeted Maersk, the big shipping company, and created damage to the supply chain. So what did we have here? Well, we had Snowden hurting the public-private partnership, sowing doubt with the private sector, sowing doubt with the federal sector also as to how well they could work together, and disclosure of how we identified or were able to respond to or detect hacking tools, attacks on our systems, and then combined with Eternal Blue that now gave up, and that was 2017, that gave up some of our offensive situations. Hence, this is why the critical infrastructure situation in the United States, in my opinion, is somewhat dire. So, what are our options? Where do we go? The quote at the top of this page is a lot about how we were looking in the early 2000s of responding to a cyber attack. If you shut down our power grid, maybe we'll put a missile down one of your smokestacks. That is certainly still an option, but it's not where the U.S. government is today. They are in the process of developing and implementing good policy and good policy and disruptive techniques that are improving our deterrent capability. Homeland Security has a 5-pillar strategy around identifying, mitigating risks, identifying vulnerabilities, and then hardening kinds of targets. We have new policies, as I mentioned, about public attribution. We have seen the Obama administration, when they actually called out the Chinese on some of the hacking, it actually slowed down or it dissipated Chinese hacking attempts. So public attribution needs to happen quickly, needs to be done, but is an effective policy thing. And then we've also talked about legal approaches, both Ph.D. Presidential Policy Directive 20 and 21, that talk about how we're going to protect systems, how we're going to respond to attack on systems. 20, specifically PPD 20, authorizes the Secretary of Defense to target cyber attacks, to target countries that launch cyber attacks to neutralize and counter them. PPD 21 talks about resiliency, preparing for and adapting to changing conditions, withstanding and recovering disruptions, and lays out how individual companies can do this. And then National Security Presidential Memo 13, signed by the Trump administration, actually targeted one of the main Russian groups, the Internet Research Agency that some of you have probably heard of, with counter cyber operations. So that's some of the policy things of what's happened. Some of the disruption things is we're doing better at assessing the risks. The creation of the CISA in Homeland Security has been critical on this. We're doing better at identifying our assets and the critical assets and protecting them. We are working on analytics and forensics to identify the source, because once we can identify the source, then we can follow through with the public attribution. And we are doing better at increasing the agility of our response, which is really important. One of the things that we've been talking about, that has been talked about when it comes to agility in response, is perhaps we need burnable tools, if you will, that aren't quite so elaborate as some of the things that the NSA has been working on, that could be used for a quick and perhaps not too damaging retaliation in cyberspace once that attribution has been looked at. The cyber kill chain, Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain, which you see on the screen, gives you an outline of how a cyber attack happens. The kill chain side of it is if you can pick up any one of those through your analytics and forensics, you can stop the attack. You can disrupt the attack up through a certain stage. So what are we looking at here? We're looking at creating a real deterrent environment in the cyber realm, denying the enemy the benefit of the attack by raising their cost of action, creating immediate response with public attribution and diplomatic confrontation. And on the final basis, I would say we also are maintaining a counter force or a counter military operation. So when we talk about deterrence, we need to know that deterrence really means we need to understand what's invaluable to the enemy. We need to clearly communicate what's valuable to us. We need to talk about in clear communications how we would respond. And if deterrence fails, we need to be able to respond with force, if you will. So the one I didn't put up there on the screen is offensive cyber capabilities, which are evolving. The last question we have in our options of how do we protect critical infrastructure is how do we judge the severity of attacks, and thus how much do we want to respond? So there's another little anecdote in history that's pertinent here. The bombing of Coventry in the UK by the German Luftwaffe during World War II. The British intelligence had, through their breaking of the Enigma code, knew that that attack was going to happen. Winston Churchill made the decision, however, that he was not going to evacuate Coventry because the evacuation of Coventry would be noticed and the Germans would understand that the British had broken the Enigma code, and his rationale was we need the Enigma code in case of an invasion. So again, Dr. Forster, can you maybe help us out here and tie that in? Well, the reality is, how much do we want to open the kimono? How much do we want an adversary to know what we can do? That's why there is so much focus on deterrence, on public attribution, on diplomatic confrontation, because we really don't want to show all of our hands on the cyber side of things, on the offensive cyber side of things. If we don't want to show all of our capabilities because we may need them in a different kind of conflict. One more story, and then I'm moving on the idea of offensive cyber. I don't know how many of you were aware of the attack that took place, offensive cyber attack that was launched against ISIS media operations in 2014. It actually resulted in taking down a good part of their media operations. We'll talk more about that in a different kind of environment. That's an offensive cyber operation used to support counterterrorism. So questions and conclusions. I'll finish up here. Does Putin seek regime change in Ukraine? Yes, I think probably he'd like a more pro-Russian leadership. But this may be achieved by increasing pressure and subversive action rather than a costly invasion. Is the recognition that Russia has security concerns in East Europe sufficient? Part of what we have to understand about Putin is he likes to be on the center stage. He wants to be viewed as a world leader. He has that ego. And I believe that the fact that security concerns are being recognized is beneficial, may pause his desire to invade. He can also claim that he is the world player that he says he is, which has benefits at home. As I talked about earlier, might there be an opportunity to bring Belarus directly into Russia? I think there is that possibility. An annexation of Belarus would remove Lukashenko, who is actually who's actually kind of a thorn in Putin's side. It would also provide opportunities, as I said earlier, to encircle Ukraine, perhaps forcing regime change, but also giving Russia increased freedom of action on its western border, read Baltic states, potentially Poland. The Russians' goal is Russia, and I would state finally, Russia's goal definitely is to erode the Ukraine's polity or will to exist. The 82nd Airborne isn't going into Ukraine. We need to seek deterrence through sanctions, but we need to be careful in understanding both NATO's unity and credibility. We need to talk about, we should use this opportunity to study Russia's new generation warfare or their hybrid warfare techniques to allow us to develop a counter strategy. And we need to know that what has happened here is probably the opposite effect, and that is Putin's actions have probably strengthened NATO and NATO's commitment to collective defense more than anything that he would know. So with that, I ran over time a little bit, Mike. I apologize, but
no worries, Peter.
That's it. Thank you, and I'm available for questions if anybody has any.
Great. Peter, let me go first here, if I may. You, I think, very helpfully addressed some of the long and complex and frequently painful history between Ukraine, which, of course, the Russians say, well, it was Kievan Rus 1,000 years ago, so it's always been part of Greater Russia. In the 1930s, millions, literally millions of Ukrainians were systematically starved to death by Stalin. It was a deliberate forced starvation. In fact, if you talk to older Ukrainians, they refer to this as the Holodomor. In your opinion, what role does that painful history going back as far as it does, how will that affect potentially the Ukrainians' response if this aggression escalates?
Right. That's a great question, and as many questions are, it's a little more complex than to say they will fight.
Right.
So we have, I think we can see a couple of different things. I'll start first of all in the east, in the Donbass region, where the large percentage of ethnic Russians live, and where there's really been an ongoing conflict since 2014 that emerged out of the things we talked about. So I think in that part we will continue to look at conflict, and I think what we see there is a manifestation of what you called the Putin-esque belief that Ukraine was always part of Russia. Ukraine was referred in Soviet times as the breadbasket of Russia. When U.S. intelligence would look at the Soviet Union, it was like, God, if we could simply break away Ukraine, Russia would probably starve to death. So that I think what we're seeing in Donbass is that reality of that Russian side of this is part of Russia, there are historical ties. This is worth fighting for in some respects, right? However, so that's the southeastern portion. Now we look at rest of the country, and I think it's the other factors that you've talked about that have galvanized the other parts of the country. We've all seen the pictures on the news of, I think the most telling one was the one on Sunday of the 72-year-old grandmother who was out undertaking military exercises. Yes. And I think what, as I think the commentator said, yeah, I'm not 72 yet. I'm a little younger than that, but the ability to go out and undertake military exercises would be a challenge for me at my age. So you have to admire that, and what I think that speaks to is what I would term Ukrainian nationalism and a belief that Ukraine is a separate country. I think the belief that, and I think in the western part of the country particularly, there is a real draw to being part of Europe, to being part of the EU, to being part of NATO, because I think they see security, I think they see economic growth, I think they see getting out from under what I will call the Russian yoke. that they have experienced, and to break away really from Putin's authoritarian leadership kinds of things. So I think I think you've hit the key factor that I think we have a real friction between these two beliefs. I would argue today that Ukrainians say, sure, there was a history, but there are lots of histories in the world where countries have, where parts of countries have broken away and have become independent. And I think, in all honesty, I don't think the Ukrainians at an individual level, and perhaps not the Russians at an individual level, short of in the Donbas region, really want conflict. I think they believe that they could coexist as mutually independent states in a mutually beneficial environment. Regretfully, the situation right now doesn't seem to give that possibility. And I'll go back, and I think that's why I think what Putin really wants is to look for a pro-Russian leader in Kyiv and look to bring them back in. I don't think that's going to fly with the Ukrainians. I think in time we will see another kind of popular demonstration.
Excellent.
I hope that answered the question. I think the Ukrainians say it would be time to move beyond the Russian yoke.
Great. No, that's excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Forster. Let me go to some of our audience members' questions. Gary Yockel, I hope I pronounced that correctly, asks, what if the recent activity is nothing more than a feint, F-E-I-N-T, that is to say a strategic deception by Putin to collect signal intelligence, communications imagery, human intelligence, military and logistical movements, etc., on both U.S. and NATO forces, and to see how they respond, or to assess the capability and intent of those forces?
Again, great question. Thank you. I guess my feeling is I don't see, and I'll get to the question, I don't see a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I think it's too costly for the Russians. I could see an invasion, as I said, of the eastern portion based on the fact that it's a Russian population. But I also think that the idea of collecting intelligence, what I talked about, the probing of NATO, I think is something that Putin is very interested in, and is something that he is anxious to gather. He wants to know, to the extent that he can figure out, how they will respond. And what I can't speak to is how he looks at the deployment of 3,000 U.S. troops to Eastern Europe. He may say, oh, well, boy, this was a mistake. What we've done is strengthen NATO. On the other hand, he may be sitting there saying, hey, what did I learn? Well, we all would love to know what his conversation with the German chancellor was. I learned that, the Germans might be willing to do X, Y, Z in a push comes to shove. We've seen in the last couple of days that Zelensky has even made some comments about, well, it's premature for Ukraine to look for NATO membership. So I think if we look at it, I think the feint has been beneficial. I think Putin could claim a victory in the sense that he has, the way Putin would phrase it is, I've gotten a guarantee from the Ukrainian president that they won't join NATO. Whether that's fake news or not, we can debate that. I think he can say, I've gained intelligence on how NATO may respond. I've seen increased U.S. presence. I've seen, which may be to him, there's a commitment. Are we going to see a permanent base in Lithuania, which is the Lithuanians have been asking for, a permanent NATO base? And he may say that NATO, he's learned something about how NATO may respond. So while we might call it a feint, and he may decide to withdraw, I think he has found some benefits, some advantages, both in the collection of intelligence and NATO response. He's collected intelligence on his own forces. How well did they execute the deployment? How quickly are they ready? And I continue to go back to this concept of deflection, that perhaps this is more of an opportunity to bring Belarus into the fold while continuing pressure on Ukraine. I don't believe the pressure will stop on Ukraine overall while Zelensky is still president, but I'm not sure he's going to use military force. Again, the new generation. So I hope that offers it. I think there's a lot that Putin would say he's learned, both positive and negative, from what's gone on in the last over the last few weeks.
Very good, very good. Thank you. I'm going to read the questions again for the benefit of folks who are calling in and don't have visual on this. So our very good friend George Giangi from the South Central Task Force asks, in your professional opinion, what would be most effective in better securing our critical infrastructure systems owned by the private sector? More government regulations or financially incentivizing security upgrades through tax laws or presumably other means?
Well, I think George's question is right at the heart of the matter, and I can't say that I would support greater regulation. I think that that's not going to work in the private sector. We know that. From my opinion, this is the world according to Peter Forster, not but I do think that tax incentives, I think guidelines from the government that says, here's what we need to do. If you can say that you have done X, Y, Z, there will be tax benefits for you to do this. I really think it's not a regulation as much as it is a discussion. We need to reinvigorate that public-private partnership that I talked about, I believe. We need to have the people both in government, but also there are a lot of expertise in cybersecurity that are not government people. And we need to bring those folks together and say, here's a process that can harden your systems, right? And here's how we can implement them. And then an incentive of perhaps tax breaks on this could be the incentive that the C-suite needs to make these decisions. I'll give you a little case study. I was at a large retail company a few years ago where we went to talk about cybersecurity, how you might implement it, what you might do. People within the organization wanted to do it. Where it came down, where the push came to shove, was from the corporate suite floor, right? And where they said, is the cost of what it's going to take me to harden these systems worth the benefit that I might get from them? In essence, it's again, the colonial pipeline thing. I can afford to pay X. Now, what I think would happen with George's question is, yes, if there are tax incentives, you begin to close that cost benefit gap. A second thing that I believe closes that cost benefit gap is to see what's happened. And we've seen some fairly hefty problems. I always go back to Target, not so much of the fine, because Target could afford an $18.5 million fine, but what it meant to individuals, particularly in the upper echelons of Target. People ended up losing their jobs, resigning at a rather senior level. And so that's an incentive too, but I think it has to be a combination of those. What do we need to do? Private, public sector, talking about how do we strengthen this, and then how do we measure that you've strengthened it, and what are the incentives that we give you?
So basically the work of InfraGard and other groups like George's, the South Central Task Force, and our good friends over at ASIS, American Society for Industrial Security. So seem we're on the right track. I wanted to ask a follow-up question on my own. Some years ago, some of us InfraGard folks got to meet a gentleman by the name of Vasil Sikaralidze, who at the time was the Georgian Republic of Georgia, that is to say, ambassador to the United States. And he spoke to us at great length about the use of those supposedly independent third-party actors that you made direct reference to earlier, Peter, for plausible deniability. And he spoke of them as being behind infrastructure attacks in like South Ossetia and Estonia, and in his country, the Republic of Georgia. Would they, in your opinion, these so-called air quotes independent groups that are really acting on behalf of Russia as a nation state, would they be used for plausible deniability, as you mentioned, to attack our infrastructure? And if so, or for that matter, our NATO allies? And if so, which infrastructure sectors do you believe they would attack first?
Well, that's kind of, you wrapped up a couple of questions there that I think are very germane. Let's look at the sector. I believe that the sector that would be at the top of the list would be the energy sector. Probably energy, transportation. Energy first and foremost, because energy runs everything ultimately, right? I mean, a lot of the other infrastructures collapse if there's no energy.
Yes.
Whether I would see that kind of little green men, I love that term, that's why I'm going to use it. Whether I see that occurring in the United States, I find that would be, I find that hard to believe. I think the FBI has gotten pretty good at identifying a range of threats to our infrastructure. And to the country itself. All we have to do is go and look back and say, you know, there hasn't been a successful jihadi terrorist attack in the United States since 2019, or one that was a foreign terrorist organization related, the Pensacola attack in December of 2019. So I don't see that necessarily as a concern in the United States. I think the United States would be able to roll up. I think FBI would roll up those cells.
Okay.
Yeah. Having said that, I do got to preface that by saying there are some groups in the United States. So we might be talking more of a domestic violent extremist threat that might at least take some guidance from Russia, perhaps. That's something I haven't looked at, but could be true. The risk to NATO, I believe, and to NATO allies is potentially higher, particularly in the border areas. I believe that the insurgency, for lack of a better term, will continue in Ukraine until there is a more pro-Russian government. But I could see that kind of thing happening in parts of NATO, the Baltic states, perhaps even in Poland, in eastern Poland, where there are Russian populations, where people could kind of come in, meld into the population, go out and create disturbances, come back in. However, as I said, overall, I think our counterterrorism efforts, both domestically and within Western Europe, have improved dramatically since 9/11, obviously, and would be a deterrent to that kind of thing. Boy, it gets a little rough. Plausible deniability goes so far, but how many years are you prepared to spend in jail?
Exactly. Yeah.
Or do you want to sell out?
You mentioned Poland. Just a quick aside. I recall about a month ago there was, and this didn't get very much attention in either the secular or the trade press. There was apparently a large leak of data, extensive data on the capabilities of the Polish military. It included a list of all of their materiel, from beans and bullets to, socks and underwear. In your opinion, is that something that was intended to basically serve notice on Poland and potentially some of the other newer NATO allies, and say, you better stay the heck out of this?
Perhaps it may also have been intel, as had been brought up at the other question. It's intel gathering. Let's see what we can learn. Here's an opportunity, higher alert. And often I think with a lot of these cyber incidents, a lot of it is kind of, particularly when this stuff is released publicly, it's more of a see what we can do kind of thing. And if we can do this, what else might we be able to do?
I see.
So the release of information in the cyber world always is kind of a double-edged sword. Is it really valuable? The OPM hack was problematic. I know people, you probably know people who got their names, they heard from folks about your name had been released. You need to change this. You need to change that because so those kinds of things could be detrimental. But I think a part of it also is see what we can do. And it goes back to that comment about the opening the kimono. How far do you open the kimono? And it leaves that doubt of what else we can do.
So this is, as folks like to say on the internet, flexing, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, let me get to one final question, and of course, if anyone has any others, we'll consider those as well. But I'm really pleased to take one from the law enforcement community. So Ashley Bleacher from PASIC, the Pennsylvania Criminal Intelligence Center. First of all, she thanks you for your time, as do we all. And she asked, building on the previous questions, do you have any thoughts on the threat of cyber attacks targeting specific sectors as opposed to supply chain third-party attack that would have the potential to disrupt across multiple sectors through the infiltration of systems via an outside partner or provider with access to critical infrastructures and data? Thinking solar winds as an example. And do you see one or the other as posing a greater threat in terms of both probability and its impact? Great question.
Great question, Ashley, and thank you for joining. I know Ashley. I've worked with her at PASIC, and it's an honor for me. First of all, I've had the opportunity to work with PASIC and to have you join. I really appreciate that. I think both of these sectors are high risk sectors. As I said before, we've seen a lot of growing interest on the parts of many groups, both nation state actors and non-state actors, in striking specific sectors. Again, the energy sector is one. We've seen some other thing, and that's we can go into cases, and I know Ashley knows those cases. So I think sector threats are highly probable. However, I think what's emerged, and this may be the results of the pandemic in many respects, is we've also begun to see the vulnerabilities of our supply chain. And while I'm not convinced that that was an immediate threat, I believe that we need to be cognizant of that shifting threat to that area because the supply chains, the third-party vendors, tend to be so vulnerable. And there is a need to harden those relationships. And by saying that, I don't mean making them more confrontational, but by strengthening the cyber connections between the two. So I would say the immediate threat right now is sector specific, but I think the evolving threat, where we may be in a year or so, is really in the supply chain sector. And that actually prove in some respects to be more vulnerable, because as we harden the other targets, again, all actors are going to look for the low-cost opportunity, low-hanging fruit. And if the supply chain sectors aren't strengthened in the cyber realm, I think it could become a very attractive target. We've seen what the impact on supply chains can happen, as I say, within the pandemic. We saw what could happen through the Colonial Pipeline attack on supply chain, what happens. So I think we're beginning to build a base of knowledge that these can have major impacts, and that's why I think it's the emerging threat.
Very good. So it's probably a perfect segue, since I don't see any other questions in the queue, Dr. Forster, to move to, I guess, our final wrap up. Our next event that we have scheduled for the first quarter is in fact going to be in partnership through Penn State University, who are the primary stakeholder here, is actually going to be a workshop in person in State College, Pennsylvania. Our good friend, Professor Nick Eftimiadis from the Homeland Security Department, is going to be organizing that, and that will deal with threats and also developing requirements to define what those threats are and respond to them to supply chains. That will be on 30 March. That is a Wednesday in State College, Pennsylvania. You're welcome to register and attend in person. We'll forward that information to you as soon as we have it. That will also be made available online as well. With that, seeing no other questions, I want to thank you so much, Dr. Peter Forster, for your time with us today. And it was tremendously valuable and a great learning experience for all of us, certainly including me. And I want to thank you on behalf of InfraGard Central Pennsylvania. I will also add that we are currently in a fundraising drive. We receive no federal or state or local funding, so we are brought to you by you. So please go to, if you'd like to learn more, to InfraGard PA, that is INFRAGARD PA.org or .com, and learn more about how you can support the work of our chapter. Peter, I believe that you, as we discussed, are going to make slides available to folks who request them.
Yeah, I will send them. So just real quickly, my email's on that last slide. If there was a question you wanted to ask, please drop me an email. I'll get back to you. Do you want me to send that to you, Mike? I will send you the slides, or what?
Yes,
how is that best distributed?
That would be great. I'll be happy to coordinate that and make sure that everyone who is qualified to receive them receives them at their request.
Okay, sorry to dump that on you. I guess I could do that. People could write to me and I'll send you slides.
Yeah, absolutely. They're welcome to contact you directly, as well as with any questions about the subject matter today.
Questions or slides? Yes, I'll make the slides available. So,
thanks so much. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you to everybody who spent their time on this.
Yes, thank you, Peter. And thanks to everyone else. We had to organize some of the particulars in fairly short notice, but I think it looks like we had over 30 attendees, and I'm grateful for everyone who could participate, and I hope you found value in it. Thanks so much, and we'll see you soon. Bye now.
Bye-bye.